What's up, Cat 3C? Here we are in week 6, moving forward with some more examples of futuristic music making, hopefully that serve as inspirational models or at least, different ways of which we can think about the overlapping of artistic practice with speculative thought. So last week we looked at alienation. We thought about different examples of technology and how technology was approached by musicians using kind of speculative and futurist ideas. This week we're going to focus quite in depth on a style what is known as Afrofuturism. And the concept itself wasn't really theorized until about the 1980s or so, but the examples that we're looking at go all the way back into the 1950s for sure. And we see examples of Afrofuturism in a lot of contemporary art and music up until this day. If you want a really simple one, I imagine many of you are very familiar with the recent Marvel take, the Marvel movie take on Black Panther. And a lot of people have pointed to that as an example of Afrofuturism. Well, let's look at some of the precedents and ways of understanding what Afrofuturism is, where it came from, and some of the underlying qualities of it. So I'd like to first kind of just take a kind of big bird's eye view, and in particular, use some of the ideas presented to you by Natasha Womack. I like this quote from her because to me, this really embodies what Afrofuturist art strives for in a way that is positive and affirming. So this idea, Afrofuturists value universal love, reinterpret sound and technology, and echo beauties of a lost past as the essence of a harmonious future. This one sentence really is kind of the, if you will, the thesis, the argument for so much of Afrofuturism as a whole. That at the heart of what Afrofuturism tries to do, it tries to be positive, it tries to be life affirming in a lot of ways, and that it directly addresses issues of media and technology, how we use that technology, and how that use of the technology itself, right, can be thought of the means to better ourselves. So I wouldn't say it necessarily falls in that same kind of binary of technophilia or technophobia that we examined, but technology is situated right in the middle of so much Afrofuturist practices. And then the last part of this engages this whole notion of temporality that we're going to be exploring in a lot of the different examples we're covering anyways. In the sense that futurism and speculative works often has to do this job of looking at the past, interpreting the past in a particular sort of way, and then using that interpretation to imagine the future. Womack gives us a couple of qualities for Afrofuturistic music that I think are common throughout all of the examples we'll be looking at this week and in the weeks to come. One is dealing with this notion of temporality and of time, and directly addressing the issues, the problematic history of the United States dealing with issues of oppression that are, part of the American experience for everybody in a lot of ways. So taking that history of oppression and then rethinking it through scientific narratives. So what does this mean? Well, thinking about what happened in the past, how Africa as this continent became was really the origins of humanity, of so much civilization, but also too the histories of oppression that emerged there and that continued on through the Atlantic slave trade, issues here in the North America, in South America, all throughout Europe, right? And thinking about that history and what was lost. So this is one kind of important thing to always think about when we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade was the fact that a lot of that slaves' histories were purposely trying to be erased. This is what I mean by forcibly denied. Um, a long time ago, my mother, she actually volunteered for the Peace Corps after she had retired from her working job. And she worked in Benin, Africa. So, as part of their training, they took this large class of Peace Corps volunteers to one of the historical sites where the slave trade occurred. And in particular, there was this large tree, this enormously large tree that was right there at the bay. And the story is that they would walk the slaves around this tree for hours on end with the idea that they were leaving their whole histories behind at that tree, their names, their families, uh, the places they came from, the stories they had with them, their language, their very identity was being taken away from them. And so to think about that experience, but within the context of a science fiction type of narrative. And then also too, thinking about a lot of the contemporary Afrocentric thought that was happening in the 1960s into the 1970s. Ideas about, well, how do we understand African American identity relative to Africa? And this is around the time period in which a lot of scholarship was being devoted to that idea. So another aspect of Afrofuturist music is dealing with the present moment. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this a little bit later on. But it's, kind of, we can think of this quote that George Clinton of Parliament Funkadelic sets up. Blackness had become commercial. In other words, when we look at examples of a lot of Afrofuturist music, it's occurring with this backdrop of other existing African American art forms. And these art forms becoming co-opted and appropriated. So whether we're talking about jazz music, whether we're talking about soul music and R&B music, down the road, thinking about things like hip hop, and the ways in which that music goes from being an underground form to eventually becoming adopted and again co-opted by industries that don't necessarily care about some of the underlying political threads that are already in that music. Well, in a lot of ways, Afrofuturist works say, you know what, that whole style, fine, it's co-opted, it's being appropriated. Well, we're going to move on from that because in a lot of ways, all it's doing is creating existing, or it's either reinforcing existing stereotypes or it's creating new stereotypes that themselves are, forms of oppression in their own way. So pushing against these kind of narratives about what Black identity might be during the 1960s, during the 1970s, the examples we'll talk about this week.